Jacob has reason to be upset. He had arranged with Laban to work 7 years for Rachel. At the end of the 7 years, a wedding feast is arranged. But the heavily veiled woman brought into him is not Rachel, it's Leah. Imagine how shocked Jacob must have been. Instead of admitting to his deceit, Laban gives an excuse. What thoughts come to Jacob's mind? Does he consider that Jehovah might be working out his promise to make Jacob's offspring plentiful, like the dust particles of the earth? We don't know. As it turns out, Leah bears him 6 sons, including Levi and Judah, family heads of the 2 most honored tribes of Israel. Of course, Jacob couldn't have foreknown this. Still, Jacob, the peacemaker, accepts Leah and goes along with Laban's outrageous request that he work an additional 7 years for Rachel. What's the lesson? It's disappointing when others don't hold to their agreements. Like Jacob, can we find it in our hearts to forgive and find a way to preserve peace with them?
We've been watching the dramatic Bible reading from this year's Pursue Peace Convention of Jehovah's Witnesses. In every convention, every year, they have one of these dramatic Bible readings where they fixate on a certain part of the Bible and try to bring it to life just by having someone read it, and then typically a governing body member explaining it or giving his interpretation. This year it's Jacob, a man who loved peace, and it's talking about how Jacob was a peacemaker and he found himself in all of these weird situations that required him to be diplomatic. And there were just 1 or 2 parts of this dramatic Bible reading that I found fascinating, and this was one of them. Now, I'm going to explain later in this rebuttal why this is an awkward part of the Bible for Mark Sanderson to be bringing to the attention of Jehovah's Witnesses. This is a part of the Bible that makes very clear that the Bible isn't exclusively a monotheistic book. And we can see some evidence for that when we go to Genesis 28, starting in verse 1, because all of this involving Jacob and Leah and Rachel, and Jacob being defrauded into serving double the amount of time so that he could eventually get the woman that he was interested in. It all stems from what's said at Genesis 28 verse 1. And Isaac called Jacob and gave him a parting blessing and commands, and said to him, "You are not to marry one of the Canaanite girls. Be off to Paddan Aram, the home of your mother's father Bethuel, and marry a wife from there, a daughter of your mother's brother Laban." Let's just pause there. Go and marry one of your cousins. Seems to be the command that's being given. So Jacob has to marry one of his cousins. And then as we read on, it says, "And may El Shaddai bless you and make you prolific and multiply you, and may you become an assembly of peoples. May El Shaddai bless you." That's weird, isn't it? Wonder who this El is. It turns out that El was a god in his own right. In fact, archaeologists have uncovered statues of El. You can go to a Wikipedia page that even shows one of these statues. Maybe Tibor can overlay it. El brackets deity, and you have there a gilded statuette of El from Megiddo. I only found out about all of this recently because I have been researching it in a book I'm going to show you later. But it turns out that the people in the Middle East worshipped a pantheon of gods, of which El was the supreme deity, and Yahweh was just one of this pantheon of lesser gods. And eventually Yahweh, the writers of the Old Testament, made it so that Yahweh effectively assumed the identity of El and became head of the gods, or the supreme god, and ultimately a monotheistic god. Again, I've only been learning about this recently, but it's interesting that it even alludes to this in Genesis, as particularly Genesis 28, where it talks about El Shaddai. Anyway, Jacob's given this job of marrying one of his cousins. Nothing creepy about that. And he gets himself in an arrangement where he is effectively defrauded. And what really got me was the casual way in which Mark Sanderson talks about being defrauded, and talks about how when you're in this sort of situation, you just need to be forgiving.
What's the lesson? It's disappointing when others don't hold to their agreements. Like Jacob, can we find it in our hearts to forgive and find a way to preserve peace with them?
This is actually an odd quirk of the Jehovah's Witness religion. It seems the leadership really aren't that bothered about fraud and theft and people not holding to their agreements. Actually, if you look at the Shepherd book, which I know you can't do if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, but you can download this if you do a bit of digging. And I happen to have an actual Shepherd book that got sent to me by a Bethelite. And if you look up the section on determining whether a judicial committee should be formed, there are pages and pages about sex and about all sorts of ways you can get in trouble by having sex with a consenting adult. You can have your family turned upside down if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you have sex with someone who isn't your marriage mate, who isn't your husband or wife. And again, pages and pages legislating in ridiculous detail over all of these laws regarding sexual immorality or porneia. But when it comes to the crime of theft, the crime of stealing, here's what it says in paragraph 21. Stealing, thievery, though all stealing is wrong, the body of elders should use discernment in weighing the circumstances and the extent of the involvement in wrongdoing to determine whether it is a judicial matter. Just one sentence in the whole chapter about stealing, and it's a very half-hearted, wishy-washy, oh well, what are the circumstances? Which is not how we approach things when it comes to whether criminals go to jail for stealing. We don't say, well, what were the circumstances? Yes, the bank robber robbed this bank, but what mitigating circumstances were there? No, if you rob a bank, you go to jail. Theft is a crime. But in the weird kind of twisted Jehovah's Witness world, it's all about sex. It's all about how people use their genitals with consenting adults. And when it comes to actual crimes, such as stealing, it's a case of, oh, well, we'll just throw in a sentence about how, yes, in some circumstances, this might be an issue. So it's Interesting that Mark Sanderson should revisit this story of Laban's deception and the way he defrauded Jacob out of 7 years of his life and then presented him with the wrong woman or with a different daughter, so that Jacob then had to serve another 7 years. And the moral of the story is that if you're defrauded in that way, it's on you to be a peacemaker, and it's on you to be forgiving.